Hey everybody, this is a quick video to show you how to complete the participation activity for this week, looking at the market for loanable funds. This is very similar to what we have in the slides, so it should be pretty simple, but I'm going to go through it really quickly one more time just to remind you, because this is stuff that we're going to build on in the next couple of weeks. So the first part, this is the savings, investment, and finance market for loanable funds activity. And we start out with GDP information. So that means we're going to start out with what we know about GDP, that it is Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Remembering that Y is national income, right? GDP. C is consumption, I is investment spending, G is government spending, and NX is net exports. And for our purposes, we're going to use the closed economy model. So we're just going to go ahead and ignore net exports. It's not the most realistic, but it still gets us where we want to go, and we can relax that assumption later if we want to. Now, the question gives us that we have, let's see here, sorry. Oh yeah, you can't see that. Okay, here we go. We're going to use the whole board today. We have GDP, or Y, is equal to $10 trillion. The consumption for this economy is equal to $6.5 trillion. And then government expenditure is equal to $2 trillion. Right? The last piece of information we have is that their government has a budget deficit. Of $300 billion, which is going to be 0.3 trillion. And what we want to remember here is what we've learned about savings in the economy, right? We have private savings, which is the savings of households, and that's equal to Y, income, minus consumption spending, minus taxes. And then we have public savings, the savings of the government. And that is equal to their revenue, taxes, minus their savings. And we want to remember that the government can have either a budget deficit or a surplus. The deficit is going to mean that we have a negative value for our public savings, and a surplus means we're going to have a positive value for our savings. And so getting this budget deficit of $0.3 trillion is telling us that if we wanted to find this equation of what public savings is, it's going to be a budget deficit of negative $0.3 equal to taxes minus government spending. We know that government spending is $2, so we kind of have the first thing we can solve for here, because that's the first part of this problem. We want to solve for public savings, private savings, national savings, investment, and taxes. So now I can insert my government spending of $2 trillion here. And now I have negative 0.3 is equal to T minus 2. I can solve this by adding $2 to each side. And so now I have $2 minus 0.03 gives me 1.7 is equal to taxes. So now I know that taxes are equal to 1.7. Cool. So far, so good. Hopefully. Now we want to solve for private savings, public savings, and national savings. So let's go point by point. And these are simple, just calculations, right? Private savings or household savings is going to be equal to Y minus C minus taxes. So that gives us our value for private savings. Household savings is going to be equal to 1.8. Cool? $1.8 trillion. Public savings we can calculate it again, even though we know it's going to be that negative 0.3, right? That negative budget deficit of $300 billion. But we can just calculate it and say, okay, well, if we have $1.7 trillion in taxes minus $2 trillion in spending, that's going to give us a budget deficit of 0.3. And then the next thing we want to remember is what national savings is. National savings is public savings plus private savings, right? So we can find it two different ways. The first way we can find it is we can say, okay, private plus public equals national savings. We can also say that national savings is equal to y minus c minus t plus t minus g, or y minus c minus g. Either way we do it, we're going to get 10 minus 6.5 minus 2, which is equal to 1.5, or 1.8 minus 0.3 is equal to 1.5. Does that make sense? That's a really important idea in this, is that national savings is private plus public. It's okay that public savings is negative. That's common in our economy, but we need to remember that national savings is those two things together. So now we have private savings, public savings, national savings. The last thing we want to do is find out how much investment is. And again, these are all connected. Remember that investment, we go back up here, if we solve for I, we're going to get I is equal to y minus c minus g, which is the same as national savings. Savings is going to be equal to investment in equilibrium, so it's again going to be $1.5 trillion. So that's how we solve that first part, 1.A. Again, if you're having problems with that, let me know. Take a look at the slides and walk through them again. But it should be, you want to just treat it as a simple algebra problem. The next thing we want to do in part 2 is graph the market for loanable funds. And so, you have all of your numbers now written down. So we can go ahead and take this away and focus on our graph. And this graph doesn't have to be perfect. What you're going to want to do is remember that the market for loanable funds is just like a market in an XY axis, only now the quantity is loanable funds. And the price is interest rate. Because an interest rate is the benefit of lending and the cost of borrowing, right? So I can draw a sort of general downward sloping demand curve and a general upward sloping supply curve. And the equilibrium is given in the problem. I'm going to have an equilibrium interest rate of 5%. And that's going to be the cost of borrowing money. You have to pay 5% interest. Or if I put money in an account and save it and lend it to a borrower, 5% is my return. And then the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds, $1.5 trillion, is given by the problem above. Cool? We want to keep in mind here that the demand for loanable funds comes from investment, investors demanding money to borrow to build a new house or start a new company or expand or something like that. And the supply comes from national savings, which means it's private household savings plus public savings. And you don't need to draw that in there, but you do want to remember that for the next part, right? Because part B says, suppose the government spends an additional $5 billion. Let's see that. $500 billion. Oops. I wrote that wrong. $500 billion. It doesn't matter. It was supposed to be 500 billion on the problem, but don't worry about it. $5 trillion doesn't matter. They're going to spend more money on vaccines for frontline workers. That is an increase in government expenditure. What's that going to do to the government budget? It's going to expand the budget deficit, right? It's going to make the deficit bigger, which means it's going to make public savings go down, which means it's going to make national savings go down, which means we're going to shift the supply of loanable funds in. So we draw the new curve on our diagram, and then we find the new equilibrium, and that tells us what happens to the equilibrium interest rate and investment value. So now we have a higher interest rate. You can pick a higher one. You can just say it's higher. I'm going to say it's going to go up to, let's say, 7%. And we're going to say that the quantity of loanable funds goes down to 1 trillion. The specifics don't matter in these cases. What we want to do is just look at the direction of the shift, right? Running a budget deficit is going to shift that supply of loanable funds in, raising interest rates, reducing the quantity of loanable funds. And that's the big takeaway. And that's what that idea of crowding out is. By running a larger budget deficit, the government is making investing for private citizens and firms more expensive. And that's one of the reasons why some economists worry about budget deficits, that it might somehow harm the economy and make it harder for firms and households to invest. So hopefully that helps you solve the participation activity. Let me know what questions you have. Hit up the discussion threads, and I will see you next time. Thanks.